You grew up in Lithuania.
Yes, I was born and raised in a town called Vilkamir in Lithuania. And in fact, I'm not really supposed to be here because everybody in my hometown was killed. It was by sheer coincidence that we moved a year before the war started, that we moved to Kovno.
You know a woman by the name of Nessie Marks?
So everybody asked me that, I have never met him, probably know her.
Because she's a Lithuanian Jew out of
Yeah,
Knoxville.
yeah. Well, I was in the Kovno ghetto, yeah. But anyway, so, I had a good childhood. We were in a kind of well-to-do family. My father had a flour mill. I'm the youngest of three children. My brother and sister were each 6 years apart. And as I said, we had a normal life till the Russians came in '39 when Germany and Russia divided Poland. So we had a border with Poland, and Russians came and take over. Then, of course, I happened to be going to a Hebrew school, not a religious school, but a Zionist school, because Hebrew was outlawed. So I was in a Yiddish school. But as it happens, my brother and sister were in Kovno at the university, and our mill burned down, so my father got a job in Kovno, and he had an apartment with my brother and sister. And before long, the Russians moved in. A army captain and his family left us one room, so it was time to move. So we left our town and we lived in Kovno. As it turns out, everybody in our hometown, everybody was killed. 4,500 Jews, all killed the first month. I do have a blank period from the time the war started until we entered the ghetto. I guess I always have to be first in some areas. I happened to be in summer camp 2 kilometers from the German border when the war broke out. So here I was a German prisoner within the first couple hours. And within a day, there were Lithuanian partisans. They separated the Jewish kids from the Gentile kids. And I can't remember a thing what happened during that month. All I remember that one young boy, see his face now, spoke back to one of the guards and they shot him. But finally, through the Red Cross, the Jewish children were brought home. So came back to Kovno sometime early August, because August 15th was the deadline when all the Jews had to move into the ghetto. So what happened during that month, I have no idea. And from what of course I understand, there were a lot of pogroms, a lot of Jews killed before the ghetto was closed. When the ghetto was closed on August 15th, people were crammed together in a very small area. There was really one room to a family, and my brother by then was married. He had a wife and a small child, and we started out with about 25,000 Jews in the ghetto. And within a month or so, they had everybody assemble at a square, and there was just a German sergeant, just as everybody had to go by. Whoever stayed in the homes were killed. Just right, left, nobody knew which side was on, and 10,000 people were marched off to a nearby fort where they were all killed. So that was the first mass killing. Then, we were in the ghetto for about 3 years. And we had a,
You were about 13, 14?
I was almost 14 when the war started. The Jewish leadership managed to talk the Germans into letting them open an art school to teach workers. So I went to the art school for about 6 months and then decided, now I'm a mechanic, because it was advantageous to go to different work brigades outside the city under guard where they used to take you, but you had a chance of bringing food or something. So I stayed, I was working during the, I'd say 2.5 years of the 3 years we're in the ghetto. And then maybe, and I don't remember exact date, but within 6 months after they took the 10,000 away, they came in one day while most people are away at work and gathered up all the old people and small children and took them away and got them killed.
Do you think that the systematic killing of people is what you remember most about the ghetto?
Well, this is about what happened, but ghetto life, went on. People worked. I happened to work was the bus station, which was part of everybody wore uniforms in Germany, of course, was part of the post office department. And I worked in the supply room, and actually my work was relatively easy there, but the German civilian that was the head of the supply room used to sell tires on the black market, and he used to make me deliver them outside. And I guess if I was caught, I'd be shot, but I had to do that. So then one day, my sister, by the way, was a medical student before the war, and she worked in the ghetto hospital as a nurse. And one morning, she came to work a little late, and there were guards all around. They wouldn't let her in. She pleaded with them. They wouldn't let her come in, and a little later, they set the hospital on fire and burned the doctors, the nurses, all the patients, So there were mostly coincidences, how we survived. Then when the Russians came near, we were, let me go back a little. There were, from the ghetto, there was still a chance sometime to escape, and I was the littlest kid in my class, and some of my friends decided to escape and fight with the partisans. Of course, my mother wouldn't let me go, but I did manage to steal some German uniforms that I gave them. Now, I have no idea if any of them survived.
How did you steal them?
Well, I worked in the supply room. Mm-hmm. I managed to tuck them away. If I could help the guy steal tires, it was easy to steal a few uniforms. And so when the Russians were advancing, they told us that we were being moved to a work camp in Germany. And we were all packed into boxcars. And there was literally no room to stand up. It was just standing room, people wedged together. And all there was a bucket of water and a bucket for sanitary purposes. We were on that train, I think, for about 3 days. You can imagine what the train looked like. Then the train stopped at a place called Stutthof, which turns out, we didn't know it at that time, was concentration camp and also extermination camp. And they told us the women and children should get off and the men will meet up with them later. I remember my mother started crying, and I said, I'll see you a little later. Of course, I never saw her again. And later, of course, I found out that my brother's wife and child were killed. And we continued on by train and wound up in a place. It was an outside Dachau, was a sub-camp of Dachau, a work camp. And there were about 2,000 prisoners. There were about several camps around there. And the first week, every day, of course, you had to line up, and they took all the smaller boys away, obviously to Auschwitz. And I was hiding behind somebody or stood on tippy toes, I don't know which, but somehow I managed to stay in that camp. At that camp, we had 2,000 people. We had an average of 25 to 35 a day, just dropping dead of starvation. And then, of course, they'd replenish new prisoners.
How were you surviving? I
I
don't mean
don't-
physically surviving.
I don't know. It's for some reason, I think you think of just today. You used to see, if you were thinking, I think about, maybe I was stupid, but if you're thinking wishing what should be or what the past was, you could see people gave up and you knew they'd be dead within a couple days. And we worked on a construction site, actually building an underground Messerschmitt factory. And we worked 12-hour shifts, 2 weeks days and 2 weeks nights, and we probably had to march a good hour and a half or two to the camp and from the camp. We would get a cup or a bowl of so-called coffee in the morning. Then when we came back, we got our ration, which was a piece of bread, picture a loaf of bread, half and about this wide, and a watery soup. That's all you got. But the typical German efficiency, when they would find every morning, dead prisoners in the barracks, if they couldn't identify them, we all had to, march by. Nobody got their food till the prisoner was identified. And that's where you saw real brutality. I mean, hanging people for, no other reason. I mean, if a German guard had stand at attention, if they were hitting you, the worst thing you could do is duck. You had to stand there and take it. But somehow I survived. I was there. I really had, at this construction site, the foreman of that group where I worked, I kind of had to clean his hut and run errands, so I really didn't do heavy work. And in fact, he gave my father a job on the inside, otherwise I don't think my father would survive. But once in a while, a crust of bread, he was nice to me, but he wouldn't give it to me. He would throw it on the floor like you throw it to your dog. And I remember one time they brought in replacement prisoners, and these were Hungarian Jewish soldiers. And they came in there, still had their uniforms on. Of course, you right away had to strip and get prison garb. And the first weeks you saw them in the morning get up and try to, wash and bathe. But I think it was such a shock to them. We were used to this gradual hunger. I think they all died within a month. They're all dead. And then when the Americans advanced, they evacuated the camp and they put it, we were on a death march, I guess is the only thing you can call it. And they marched us to the main camp in Dachau. And later when I check dates, I find out the day after we left the camp, the Americans arrived.
Tell me about the march.
Well, the march, we all marched, and anybody that dropped out in the back, the guards would shoot them.
You marched from where to where?
The camp was near Landsberg, which is, I don't know how many miles from Munich. And we marched to the main Dachau camp. We spent one night at the Dachau camp. Then they marched us again. And in fact, my father was left with a week and dying. He couldn't walk anymore. And on that march, I think it lasted, let's see, we started on April 28th, or on April 24th, we left for a march to Dachau. I guess on April 28th, we left Dachau, and they were marching us towards the Bavarian Alps or someplace. And May 2nd, we woke up and there were no guards. I was liberated on May 2nd. But the interesting thing was, again, everybody who dropped out would be shot. And at one point, we saw a bunch of guards and dogs go ahead of us. And you just like, cattle marching. Figure they're changing guard. During that period, the Americans were so close that anybody that dropped out was liberated, And so I was liberated on May 2nd. Then
Tell me about that day. Tell me about May 2nd.
Well, we woke up, they marched us for some reason at night, and we rested during the day, excuse me. And I remember all we carried with us, of course, is the blanket. And woke up, and there was this much snow on top of the blanket. But we looked around, there were, no guards. So we roamed around, and there was this little town. It was right in the Bavarian Alps. And I remember it was a dead horse, and a lot of, prisoners were hungry, came running, getting the meat. Most of them died. It was contaminated meat somehow. And by the way, my brother, who's 12 years older than I was, he says it's different, but trust me, I dragged him. He used to want to give up during the march. I can't walk anymore. Anyway, I seemed to, during the camp, for some reason, I wind up taking care of my brother and my father. And that day, we were in a little village, and we knocked on a door. Some Germans took us in, and I know we took a bath, and the first time we slept in a bed. And after a few days, American Army took us to Munich, where it was an old German army camp where they started a DP camp in Munich. And I was there. That camp existed for many years, but I'd say after 3-4 weeks, I decided I have to get out of there. So a friend of mine and I took a walk, and we found an army company, and I asked them. In fact, I worked in the kitchen. Of course, I got food and clothing. So I worked for the army for about 3-4 months, and helped me brush up on. I had 2 years of English in school, which of course you know as much as what you get 2 years of Spanish. But it helped me brush up on English, and then I went back to the same DP camp, and I worked as a translator, because we always had people from
What DP
different
camp were you
countries. That was
That was in Munich, right?
actually was in Munich, but I think it was a suburb of Munich. I can't remember. Freiman. And interestingly enough, the UNRWA team was a retired Jewish army captain who was the head of our team, and another Jewish officer that retired and stayed on, and one Jewish lady from Palestine, and one Jewish mother, volunteer lady from New York. And I worked at that camp for, again, maybe 3-4 months. Then, believe it or not, I got a job as a translator at the American consulate. And for interviews, people, applying to go to the United States. And my father's entire family happened to live in the United States. My grandfather was there. My father was the only one of his side of the family in Europe. So I managed to actually, I left on the second troop transport, so in July 46, I left for the United States. So I was, in Germany really a year after the war.
I want to take you back just a minute.
Okay.
Your day of liberation, May 2nd. You wake up, blanket covered in several inches of snow. There's no guards around. You're with your brother.
First thing, you're hungry.
Hungry.
That's the first thing you're looking for. Try and find food.
When did you realize you were free?
Well, it didn't take
When
long.
you didn't see the guards?
I mean, we didn't see the guards. Of course, we knew that they were running. I mean, you know, you knew that.
When did you know that the liberation was pending? At what point in the camp do you think you heard?
We didn't, because the guards had orders to kill us if the, Americans advanced. So, we didn't have any hopes for liberation. You're gone by the day. As I said, I think you live because you only live by the day. If you start thinking of tomorrow, tomorrow never came. I really think it's
You think
that
your
simple.
ability to stay in the moment that you were dealing with was the key to your survival?
That's what I think now, and that's the only reason, I think.
What about your brother? Do you think
Probably
the
the
fact that you were
same.
together?
Well, we're together. As I said, I looked after him. Oh, and then, by the way, after we were brought to Munich, and I think a week later, I heard that there were some survivors in Dachau. So I walked with a friend of mine to Dachau. I think Dachau is 7 kilometers from wherever I was. And I found my father, and I brought him back to Munich. And as I said,
Your father where?
what?
You found
My father was in Dachau, actually in the
You
main
found
camp of Dachau, yeah. And as I said, I didn't stay at the DP camp. We rented a room in a village nearby, and my father and brother and I lived there. And frankly, I don't know where I got money to pay for it, but I managed. And
You find it extraordinary that you, your brother, and your father all survived?
oh, definitely. And then, of course, my mother and sister were in the camp. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the ghetto. Of course, there was no medicine or hospitals or anything. So when they were in the camp, and it was a very brutal camp, the one that my mother and sister were at, and my sister did her work and carried her, and carried her to a death march, and so my mother actually lived through liberation, died a month later, after liberation. So at least we know where she's buried, but. So,
You mentioned
it's surprising that so much, well, considering my brother's family were all killed, and of course all our relatives on my mother's family, her sister and family and everybody was killed. Our family, we mostly came out intact.
You mentioned the nice man, your words, who threw you the crust of bread.
Yeah.
He wouldn't hand it to you, he threw it on the ground.
The same guy, I saw him get mad. This was, by the way, everything was done in a big way. This was a concrete mixing station where they pumped a concrete building that reinforced the underground factory. And to give you an idea, every load of cement, concrete mix took a small carload of cement, and gravel. That's how much they mixed at a time. And the same guy, I saw him get mad and scream and push one of my friends right into the cement bin. And of course, he suffocated and died. So was he nice? And in fact, interestingly enough, he was captured, while I was still in the DP camp. The American soldiers had him on a truck, and he saw me. I couldn't get myself to come out and say a good word about him. I couldn't. But then I left everything behind and went on with my life.
Did you leave it behind?
I definitely did. When people, I speak to a lot of groups and schools, and there's always questions. Do you hate them? And I always felt carrying hate. You're the only one that's your stomach is churning. The other one doesn't even know it, so I never let it bother me. I don't have nightmares. I remember sometimes, it gets to you, but I don't carry it with me. I carry no baggage.
So when it gets to you, as you said,
Hey, when you talk about it once in a while, you just, feel a little choked up and you go on.
how do you explain the evil?
You can't. You can't when you think that these are the same people that probably went home to their family and
These are
kids.
fathers.
Yeah, and how they treated people. It's unimaginable how people can be this cruel. And there was no reason for it, but that's the way it was done.
You're a father.
Yes.
You see 10, 12, 13-year-old children. Your children were once 13. You see how young that is.
Oh, yeah. But it's interesting. My children never asked. I never refused to answer questions, but for a long time they never asked questions.
Do you think it has something to do with the way that you've gone on? You said you put it behind you.
But maybe. Only one time I told my son, and something he wouldn't eat, I said, when I was in concentration camp, I would have given anything for it. He said, maybe you should have stayed there. That's Ray, my good son. You won't believe it of him, would you, Rob?
So what do you want people to know when the children ask you?
Oh, well, I speak to schools, and surprisingly enough, you get all kinds of questions. I've had fifth graders ask questions for about an hour and a half or 2 hours. Once in a while, a kid asks, did you ever meet Hitler? But most of the time, there were very serious questions, and
What are the ones you can't answer?
I tell them right up front, there's no question that you can't ask. And
No, I mean you emotionally. What do they ask that you really have no answers for?
if I don't have an answer, I just say, I can't think of any, but I don't hold back.
Do they want to know why?
Oh, sure. Well, they want to know why. I remember the very first time I spoke to a group, my daughter was at Emory at Holocaust Studies, and she talked me into, of course, speaking to her class. What she didn't tell me, the week before they had Elie Wiesel. But I remember,
Perfect, follow.
yeah, well, I didn't know any better, so I did the best I could. But I remember some kid asked me, can it happen again? And my answer was, if you let it. And, just...
You mentioned your messages were to never forget and treasure your freedom.
Well, that's really what I preach. Interestingly enough, just recently we're talking with a bunch of my friends, and I said, you guys, and not that anybody complained, but I said, you guys really don't know what it's being an American like. Because you never, I always said I don't want my kids to lose their freedom to find out how precious it is. But something you value.
And what brought you to Tennessee?
I started a business my business was in Chicago. And then I built a plant in Morristown, and I thought I would set it up and leave it alone. Well, to make a long story short, I commuted for 14 years every week, Chicago to Knoxville, and finally moved. And so I've been in Tennessee now for 25 years. And I guess because go ahead. Well, to show you, my last business, I had a joint venture with a German company. And this German, he was 6 years old during the war. And we became good friends. His father could have been the worst killer, but he hasn't done anything to me. And this is the attitude I have. I remember the first time had a stopover in Germany. It was in '62. I was in Finland. And when I saw the buses and the efficiency, couldn't get off the plane. But then later in the early '70s, I started a business. Most of the equipment was done in Germany, and I started traveling to Germany. And
How was that?
weekends I had to get out. But, it's interesting. You dealt only with young people. The old guys stayed in the background. So, it's...
Did you go back to Dachau?
No. And just like I would never set foot, people want to go back to Lithuania. Only reason I'd want to go back to Lithuania is to reclaim our property and set it on fire. I don't carry the hatred for the Germans as I do for the Lithuanians. These were our neighbors and friends, and they killed everybody. They did all the killing.
I'm a descendant of Hungarian survivors, and the main feeling through my family with the victims, survivors, is that they were more, the sense of betrayal was stronger among the neighbors than the Nazis themselves.
That's the way I feel. And I was a kid, really. I only know what happened, but the way the Lithuanians behaved, well, there was always anti-Semitism in Lithuania, and I have, kids ask me, why is there anti-Semitism? I said, I'll give you two reasons. First of all, you lived, and I'm hardly in a position to give philosophical answers. You live in a country where all your life you've been told the Jews killed Christ. Mm-hmm. And then most of them, whether you're on a farm or you worked a couple years in school, that was enough. Then you went to work. And I always try to tell people that Jews, as a rule, education was the most valued and respected thing. In our little town, the two most respected people in town were the teacher and the doctor. And so guess what happens when you go to school? You have a better job, and you have a better life. There's envy. Those are, in my opinion, those are the two basic. And of course, at home, you're taught at home prejudice. You don't pick it up on your own.
Thank you.
And the only other thing that I have to add is, I had my 50th anniversary 5 years ago, and had a family picture taken, and my brother-in-law said to me, you one over Hitler. There's one of me, now there was 13. I think now there's 15 of us. So I guess I made a life and raised 4 children, educated them. They're good kids. What else can you ask for?
Thank you.
You're welcome. You want another 6 hours? Keep asking questions. I'll give you answers.